Nearly 3 times the length of a football pitch and as wide as a 6-lane motorway, the Derbyshire was one of the biggest ships ever built, and she should have been unsinkable. But in September 1980, suddenly, violently, the Derbyshire vanished without a trace, and with her, all 44 people on board. For years, the cause of the tragedy remained a mystery, until a team of experts, armed with the latest in ocean exploration equipment, set out on a voyage of discovery, determined to find out what had sunk the biggest British merchant ship ever lost at sea. The 11th of July 1980, Sept-Îles, Quebec. The conveyor belts had been running night and day for 36 hours, feeding the cavernous belly of the Derbyshire. She was one of the newest and largest ships in the British merchant marine fleet. 21 stories from the engine room to the top of the bridge, 300 meters long. So vast, the captain needed binoculars to see what was happening on the bow. She had 9 cargo hatch covers, each the size of a tennis court and weighing 30 tons. Once loaded, she'd be carrying 157,000 tons of iron ore, this time bound for a steel mill in Japan. The crew prepared the Derbyshire to sail. For the 42 crewmen and 2 wives on board, this would be home for the next 2 months. Peter Lambert of Liverpool had been crewing bulk carriers for 2 years. He first went to sea at the age of 17. He could not have known that this would be his last voyage. Captain Geoffrey Underhill plotted the course. Across the Atlantic Ocean, around the bottom of Africa, over the East China Sea, and finally to the coast of Japan. But they would never reach their destination. The voyage would end in one of the most mysterious disasters in seafaring history. The 6th of September 1980. After 2 uneventful months at sea, the Derbyshire and her crew were just a few days from safe harbor in Japan. But the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse. A storm warning came in from Tokyo. An ugly weather system was developing to the south, and it showed all the signs of turning into a typhoon.
This massive thing that is sitting there and is coming towards you.
Robin Williams was one of the key investigators who would help unravel the mystery of what happened to the Derbyshire.
Typhoons are monster weather systems, 500 miles across. It doesn't creep up on you in the dead of night. It's not like that. It's there on the horizon, and you know it's there.
21 hours later, just after midnight, the tropical storm had just been upgraded and was given a name, Typhoon Orchid. It was headed straight for the Derbyshire. More than 300 kilometers from the center of the storm, the massive ship was outside the danger zone, but not far enough to escape the ferocious winds and seas.
What's it like to be that close to a typhoon? You get spume coming off the swell tops, you get horizontal rain.
Nigel Malpas, former chief officer of the Derbyshire and perhaps the luckiest man alive. He was supposed to have been there with his crewmates on the Derbyshire's last fatal voyage. By a quirk of fate, the orders never reached him. but just a year before, Malpas had sailed her on the same route. Through the seas, sailors called Typhoon Alley.
We would see green water coming over the forward end, running down the deck, going over the side, draining away. We would see spray coming up and probably hitting the bridge fronts here.
Inside, Peter Lambert and his 43 crewmates did the only thing they could: wait it out. But the Derbyshire was so huge that even in the roughest seas, the crew barely felt her moving.
There is a great sense on a big ship like that where you feel cocooned in some way. You are protected from the elements by being inside. You have this overwhelming feeling that this is the center of the universe at times.
The 8th of September. By then, the storm was so intense, visibility had dropped to zero. Captain Underhill was relying on the shore authorities to advise him on the course of the typhoon. But the weather updates from Tokyo and Guam weren't much help. Each had Orchid in a different position and moving in a different direction. Most typhoons follow a predictable course and blow over in 6 hours or so, but not Orchid. This typhoon was moving erratically, sometimes doubling back on itself. And worse, it hadn't let up in 36 hours. For the first time, everyone on board could feel the ship start to pitch.
It's not just a vertical lift, it is the seesaw motion at the same time. By that time, the swell will have got considerably steepened and you wouldn't see the horizon. The amount of spume and spray that was going around, the visibility is greatly restricted.
Nightfall on the 9th of September. Captain Underhill had been trying to outrun the storm for 2 days, but Typhoon Orchid finally had the Derbyshire in its teeth. Escape was no longer an option. He radioed shore authorities that they'd hove to in heavy seas. It meant he turned her into the storm to try and ride it out. It was the last anyone would ever hear from the Derbyshire. Sometime in the next few hours, the Derbyshire disappeared.
I have to say they were all my friends. My mind goes a blank when I try to visualize what it must have been like those last few minutes.
Whatever happened, it was fast and ferocious, and left the Derbyshire 4,000 meters down, a shipwreck on the ocean floor. The Derbyshire, a British merchant ship so enormous she had to be built in sections and then pieced together. Sometime during the night of the 9th of September 1980, she sank in a violent typhoon off the southeast coast of Japan. No mayday was ever heard. In Liverpool, families of the crew learned there'd been trouble at sea. But when Peter Lambert's brother got the news, he still had hope that the Derbyshire and her crew would be found safe.
Well, the phone call was that they'd lost contact with the Derbyshire. She'd been in rough seas, the mast had probably been broken, they can't radio out, and everything will be okay.
But 4 days after that phone call, there was still no sign of the Derbyshire. Then, in the East China Sea, a search plane spotted an oil slick 65 kilometers from her last known position. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first piece of evidence that the Derbyshire had sunk.
I mean, this was a brand new ship, massive ship. She was classed on the same lines as the Titanic, unsinkable.
6 weeks later, a passing freighter found an empty lifeboat torn from the deck of the Derbyshire. Then nothing. Without witnesses or much evidence, the British government didn't hold a formal investigation. The loss of the biggest ship in the British merchant fleet and all 44 on board was ruled an act of God. But for the families of the dead sailors, that wasn't good enough.
My mother, all she kept on asking was why. Why the Derbyshire sank? Why wasn't Peter coming home? And I remember saying to her, I don't know, but I'll find out.
Paul Lambert would deliver on that promise. Before he was finished, the hunt for the Derbyshire would become the most ambitious underwater investigation in history. What sank this giant so fast, her crew didn't even have time to radio for help? Could it have been an explosion in the engine room that fatally wounded her? Or was she ripped apart by a rogue wave, a phenomenon many scientists refuse to credit as real? Did the ship itself have an undetected flaw that sealed her fate? Or worst of all, did a crewman make a critical mistake that took the lives of everyone on board? The evidence that might hold the answers lay buried 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the sea, and it almost stayed buried forever. It took 7 years, but then, in November of 1986, another disaster at sea changed everything. The Kowloon Bridge, one of the Derbyshire's sister ships, identical in design and construction, ran aground off the coast of Ireland. Divers discovered a massive crack in the hull, caused by the failure of one of the 300 steel ribs that formed the skeleton of the ship. Frame number 65. Had the Derbyshire had the same hidden fatal flaw? If the ship cracked at frame 65, death came swiftly.
If she had done, it would have been a brittle fracture, which would have took 1 second to snap that ship in half, and for the accommodation part, where everybody was, to sink.
If the hull of the Derbyshire had cracked as it did on the Kowloon Bridge, it meant that 4 other ships, built from identical blueprints, were potential death traps. The only way to know for sure was to find the wreckage of the Derbyshire. But no one knew where the ship lay, except a long way down.
We were told we would never, ever find the Derbyshire by the shipping industry, by the government. It will not be found. So we had to prove that we could find it.
Spring 1994. Nearly 14 years after the Derbyshire sank, Paul Lambert finally had an ally. The Seafarers Union had agreed to put $1 million into an expedition to find the Derbyshire. But shipwreck hunting is an expensive business. $1 million would buy just 8 days. 8 days to search 450 square kilometers of ocean. It seemed an impossible task. The expedition leader, David Mears,